Okay, everybody, this is Joseph P. Farrell. It's April 11th, 2013. We are in the year beyond Thunderdome, beyond the apocalypse, and this is news and views from the Nefarium. And I have a really interesting one today. It's way off the beaten track, as you might expect, but I wanted to kind of update everybody. First, to thank you for all of you sending articles, donations, especially to that dear lady and a gentleman in Illinois. You know who you are, and a big thank you to you. And for all of the prayers and inquiries about the book. Now, the book that I'm writing now, Covert Wars and the Clash of Civilizations, again, for those of you who want from me a kind of storybook approach to extraterrestrials, UFOs, and so on, you're not going to get it. If you want tales of abductions or encounters or the latest in the E.T. soap opera, you can go elsewhere. This book is really more about the culture of the breakaway civilization and how they might look at things based on some ideas and evidence, some of it not very well known. I think some of it will kind of surprise many of you. A couple of things in particular, and again I'm looking at some of the personnel involved. So it's a different sort of approach. I'm doing it kind of to supplement the research that Richard Dolan, Jim Marrs, and some other people have done on this idea of a secret space program that's being conducted by the breakaway civilization. Which brings us to the subject of today's news and views. And I really would like to talk about Germany and gold and the fact that Germany owes Greece about 160 billion euros in war reparations. And, you know, we could speculate wildly that this might have something to do with Nazi internationals and no surrenders of the Nazi Party during World War II, but we won't go there. We are talking about breakaway civilizations and secret space programs. And I had a couple of really interesting comments on the website. In fact, they're so interesting that they form the basis of today's news and views from the Nefarium. Now, the first one concerns the blog that I wrote, I think this last week, about NASA wants to capture an asteroid, move it to the moon, and mine the asteroid. Now, that implies, folks, that, you know, NASA is always telling us what they're going to do, but in point of fact, I suspect that what they're really saying is we're already kind of planning this or have been planning this sort of thing secretly. Now, let's go back to Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations for a moment. In that book, I spent a great deal of time summing up what I believe the real story behind all of the bearer bonds scandals is. Now, that story is basically, number one, that after World War II, the Anglo-American Western financial oligarchs, in conjunction with the American military-industrial intelligence complex, set up a vast, huge system of fraudulent financing to literally rob the wealthy, certain wealthy people, of their money in order to finance at the deepest level a multi-trillion-dollar secret space program. Now, I didn't get much into the reasons why they felt they had to do that in Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations. I'm going to be doing that in the coming book. In other words, I'm going to be providing what I think are the reasons or justifications that they saw for taking that kind of drastic action. Now, in that book, in Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, I basically boiled the argument down to the idea that you don't counterfeit what doesn't exist. In other words, the very fact that you have people willing to indulge in these huge counterfeiting grifter schemes are basically arguments for the fact that something exists in the background in order for them to do that. Now, I also argued that this constituted the deepest layer of covert financing. It's beyond the black budget. It's so black because it's fraudulent in essence. And I had a number of people write me and say, well, this system won't work. And folks, I'm not arguing that it will work. I don't think it will. I'm simply arguing a historical case that this is what I think they did, all right? Now, in Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, I made in passing the suggestion that what they were doing in this system of finance was they were really collateralizing what they hoped they would find in outer space with outer space exploration. And then NASA comes along and says, we want to mine asteroids. Well, there you have the collateralization in the trillions of dollars, the amount of money that we see evident in this fraudulent system of finance. Now, I want to go back to the year 1999. I did a little searching, and I found this article by the BBC News. It was dated July 22nd, 1999. The article headline is Science Technology Gold Rush in Space. And I want to read a couple of things from this article that says the most detailed study of an asteroid shows that it contains precious metals worth at least $20,000 billion. In other words, $20 trillion. Just about the current size of the American federal government deficit, just about the size that some estimate to be that vast fraudulent bearer bonds system of finance. The data were collected last December by the Near-Earth Asteroid Rendezvous spacecraft, which passed close to the asteroid Eros. It provided an unprecedented look at one of the mountains of rock that fly around the solar system. The first conclusions of that encounter are now published in the journal Science. Now, it goes on to say, if Eros is typical of stony meteorites, then it contains about 3% metal. With the known abundances of metals in meteorites, even a very cautious estimate suggests 20,000 million tons, or 20 billion tons, of aluminum, along with similar amounts of gold, platinum, and other rarer minerals. In the 2,900 cubic kilometers of Eros, there is more aluminum, gold, silver, zinc, and other base and precious metals than have ever been excavated in human history, or indeed could ever be excavated from the upper layers of the Earth's crust. So there you have it, folks. There's a vast mineral treasure house waiting out there to be mined. All right. Now, it's interesting that they're pointing this out with respect to the asteroid Eros, because Eros is precisely one of those asteroids that NASA's talking about in its mining operation most recently. And it's also one of those asteroids that's in near-Earth orbit, all right? In other words, it's one of those objects that they deliberately monitor in case it should ever become a threat to the Earth. So we're seeing now a kind of a twin fulfillment of the idea, in my opinion, a gradual release of information telling us that they have or are developing the technologies to mine these things. And they're also kind of doing it in a subtle way, because this asteroid does constitute, as in their thinking, one of those asteroids that they need to monitor in case it ever becomes a danger or a threat to planet Earth. And secondly, they're also telling us, hey, we have the capability, or we're starting to think about getting the capability to move these things around. And that means you can weaponize it. And secondly, it means you can capture it and mine it, as they told us the last time that I mentioned in the blog. So this is a really interesting story. To me, this confirms, albeit in a roundabout kind of corroborative way, the idea that they have been developing these sorts of technologies for a very long time. And that's a topic I intend to get into in more detail in Covert Wars and the Clash of Civilizations. It's a very, very interesting article, too, for the fact that this appeared in the BBC prior to the turn of the millennium. So watch this story, folks. I imagine that we're going to be hearing more stories kind of seep out. Now, the other thing I want to mention to you, a lot of you emailed and asked me what I think about this, and that's the fact that the NASA website is completely down. And they say what they're doing is they are going through all of their files, online reports, images, and so on, to take out any potential threats to the embargo that the United States has placed on materials going overseas that could constitute a national security threat. I strongly suspect, folks, that when NASA's website comes back up, and I think eventually it will, that you're going to see a lot of the data that you and I and Richard Hoagland and Mark Carlotto and Dr. John Brandenburg and so on and so forth have been talking about for a long time. I strongly suspect you're going to see a lot of that data either missing or altered. Because I think now the point is coming home that there is a technological capability that we either have or are on the cusp of having. And this in turn is going to drive the speculation concerning ancient artifacts and so on in the solar system even more tremendously. Now, with that in mind, I want to direct your attention to a new movie that is scheduled to be released on August 9th of this year, or in other words, 8-9, for those of you into esoteric numerology. That will be significant. This movie stars Matt Damon, Jodie Foster, and Alice Braga. It's written by Neil Blomkamp and directed by Neil Blomkamp. The movie is called Elysium, all right? And the first thing I want you to note, I'm going to try and hold this up so that you can see it in the camera, is the poster for the movie shows a human being with an exoskeleton, and there's a transhumanist theme right there. Presumably that's Matt Damon in his superhero outfit. But I want to read you the interesting description of this movie. This was brought to my attention by a reader of the website by the name of Brian, so thank you, Brian. It says, quote, set in the year 2159, where the very wealthy live on a man-made space station, while the rest of the population resides on a ruined Earth, a man takes on a mission that could bring equality to the polarized worlds, unquote. Now, to me, if you're like me, you believe that Hollywood has been in the hands of the elite for a long time, and that they always kind of release subtle messages of what they're really up to in movies and television and so on. This is a very intriguing version or remake of the old Alternative 3 hypothesis. You remember that April Fool's joke that was put on by ITV in Great Britain, in East Anglia, back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And the idea of Alternative 3 was that you had a secret elite that realized that planet Earth was dying, and what they were planning to do was remove a cadre of the most gifted human individuals, take them to Mars, terraform the planet, and start humanity all over again. Well, now you have a kind of a different version of that idea, that you have the elite escaping to a space station, living high on the hog in luxury in orbit around the planet of Earth, while the rest of humanity has to survive on a ruined Earth. And we're not really told how it's been ruined, but nonetheless, they're telling us that it has been. Now, that should sound familiar to those of you who are acquainted with ancient Babylonian and Sumerian, and for that matter, just lump it all together, Semitic mythology, all right? In those mythologies, there is a statement, and this is something that George Ann Hughes has mentioned quite often, in one of the pseudepigrapha, I believe, that the elite escaped off the earth and looked down on the destruction of the flood, and they escaped Earth to the high noon in the sky and so on, and beheld the destruction and wept, all right? And you find a similar scenario talked about in Sitchin's books and so on, based on these ancient texts. The movie, interestingly enough, evokes that image because the title of the movie is Elysium. The Elysian fields in Greek mythology were the fields reserved for the human beings who had a close association with the gods and demigods and were kind of almost immortal, all right? So the Elysian fields connote this dwelling in Olympus, this dwelling with the gods, and that's what we find being evoked in this movie. It's another replay of mythology. But the problem now is with the mythology, you see, the technology is catching up with it, and the technology is making that mythology possible. And given some of the known statements of the elite, I'm thinking particularly of Gardner back in the 1950s, given some of the statements of the elite that there's an overpopulation problem, the carrying capacity myth, of course, that we know dates from the banking elite of Venice. And of course, back then it was 3 billion people. Well, they keep pushing the carrying capacity up. And the problem is, of course, this is just another one of those fearmonger memes that elites like to use. But now we have the Elysium version of Alternative 3. We have the updated mythology made possible by technology. So we have to watch these people very, very carefully, folks. They are acquiring the means to do this. And I suspect a lot more is in play than just Elysium and so on and so forth. But for that, you have to wait for the new book. Anyway, that's it for news and views from the Nefarium for Thursday, April 11th, 2013. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. See you on the flip side, and God bless.